The laughter in Lord Wei's hall was as sharp and cold as the winter wind rattling the silk banners. It was a cruel sound, honed by privilege and disdain, and it was all directed at his daughter. Leanne stood before the throne, her head bowed not in reverence but to hide the deep crimson birthmark that bloomed across the left side of her face, a permanent shadow from her temple to her jaw. To the opulent court, it was the mark of a curse, a divine jest that had rendered her worthless, unmarriageable. Today, her father had decided to complete the joke. Before her stood a foreigner, a man known only as Cale, the rancher who had bought the useless, rocky stretch of land bordering Wei's western province. He was a giant of a man, his face a landscape of old scars and solitude, his eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was an outcast by choice, a man who spoke their tongue with a guttural accent and preferred the company of his horses to that of any human. He was a brute in their eyes, barely a man at all. As payment for the land taxes you so surprisingly managed to produce, Lord Wei announced, his voice dripping with theatrical magnanimity, I bestow upon you a gift. A wife, he gestured to Leanne, a flick of his wrist as if discarding a piece of trash. She is, as you can see, flawed. But she is of noble blood. She will bring character to your humble estate, the court roared. The joke was perfect, the cursed noblewoman wed to the foreign beast. A fitting end for them both. Leanne's hands, hidden in her sleeves, trembled. She had learned long ago that tears only invited more scorn. She felt Cale's gaze on her, heavy and unreadable. She braced herself for the same revulsion she saw in every other face, the pity that was somehow worse than the hate. He did not speak. He simply walked forward, his worn leather boots silent on the polished marble. He stopped before her, so close she could smell the scent of earth and pine that clung to him. He knelt, not in supplication, but to meet her lowered gaze. His eyes, she saw now, were not stormy but deep, and for the first time, she saw no judgment in them. He held out a large, calloused hand. It was a simple, honest gesture, a world away from the conniving and cruelty of the court. After a lifetime of flinching from touch, she found herself, slowly, placing her small, trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, yet gentle, a silent promise of something she dared not name. The journey to his ranch was a silent one, conducted on the back of a steady, shaggy horse. Leanne rode behind Cale, her hands clutching the rough-spun wool of his tunic, her cheek pressed against the solid wall of his back. The gilded cage of her father's palace shrank behind them, replaced by rolling, barren hills and a sky that seemed to stretch into infinity. The world grew quieter, simpler. The air was clean, sharp with the scent of wild sage and dust. When they arrived, the sun was setting, painting the desolate landscape in hues of orange and purple. The ranch was not a grand estate but a small, sturdy house built of stone and dark wood, with a barn standing nearby and a corral holding a handful of horses. It was humble, isolated, and to Leanne, it looked like the safest place on earth. Cale dismounted and then turned to help her down, his hand spanning her waist with an unnerving ease. He released her the moment her feet touched the ground. Inside, the house was sparse but immaculately clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, and a small alcove held a simple bed with a patched quilt. He gestured toward it. "That is yours," he said, his voice a low rumble. He then pointed to a pile of furs near the hearth. "I will sleep here." He expected fear, tears, a noble woman's tantrum. Leanne only nodded, her eyes wide as she took in the quiet solitude of the space. That night, he prepared a simple meal of stew and hard bread. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. He did not press her to speak. He did not stare at her mark. His gaze would meet hers for a moment, then respectfully drift away. When she had finished, he took her bowl, washed it, and then retreated to his furs, turning his back to give her privacy. Leanne lay on the small bed, the quilt rough against her skin, and listened to the steady sound of his breathing mingling with the fire. For the first time in her life, no one was laughing. No one was whispering behind their hands. The silence was not empty, it was filled with a palpable, unspoken respect. Here, in this desolate place with this silent, scarred man, the shame that had been her constant companion began, for the first time, to loosen its grip. Days bled into a quiet routine. Cale would rise before the sun to tend to his horses, and Leanne would wake to the smell of wood smoke and brewing tea. He never demanded anything of her. He simply left a portion of food for her on the table and went about his work. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to make the small house her own. She swept the stone floors until they shone, patched the worn spots in his tunic with thread she unraveled from her own lavish, useless gown, and learned the rhythms of the hearth, keeping the fire alive. She found a strange peace in the simple, meaningful tasks. One afternoon, while mending a fence near the house, she felt a sharp tug and looked down to see that a small, intricately carved jade button had come loose from the sleeve of her travel cloak and fallen into the thick dust. She searched for it, her fingers sifting through the dirt, but it was gone, a final, tiny piece of her old life swallowed by this new one. She felt a pang of loss, not for the palace, but for the memory of the seamstress who had sewn it, the only person in her father's house who had ever shown her a sliver of kindness. She said nothing of it to Cale. A few days later, she found it sitting on the table beside her morning tea. It was cleaned and polished, the green stone gleaming. Cale was outside, his back to the house as he groomed a horse, but she knew. He had seen her distress, had searched for the button after she had given up, and had returned it without a word. She picked it up, its coolness a comfort in her palm. It was no longer just a button, it was a message. I see you. I see your small sorrows. Their communication was a language of gestures. He would leave a single, hardy wildflower on the windowsill for her. She would ensure his water skin was full before he left for the day. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in short, direct statements about the land, the weather, the horses. He told her their names, Ghost, Shadow, and Ember. He showed her how to brush their coats until they shone, his large hands guiding hers with surprising gentleness. She learned the landscape of his face was not one of cruelty, but of hardship survived. Her birthmark, which had defined her entire existence, seemed to be something he never even saw. He looked at her eyes, her hands, the way she moved. He looked at her. One evening, a sudden storm rolled in, and a fierce gust of wind blew the door open, extinguishing their only lamp and plunging the room into darkness. Leanne gasped, a primal fear of the dark instilled by years of being locked in her rooms as punishment. Before the fear could take root, she felt his presence beside her, a solid, calming shadow. He didn't touch her, but his voice was a low anchor in the roaring dark. I am here. You are safe, and in that moment, she believed him. The fragile peace of their world was shattered by the arrival of 3 riders. They were not lost travelers. They moved with the swagger of hired muscle, their clothes dusty but well-made, their eyes cold and predatory. They reined in their horses before the small house, their leader, a man with a jagged scar on his lip, dismounting with a sneer. Cale, the foreigner, he called out, his voice laced with contempt. Your luck has run out. Lord Wei sold your debt to Baron Feng. This land is his now. You have until sundown to gather your things and be gone. Cale emerged from the barn, his expression unreadable, his hands empty but held loosely at his sides. This land is paid for, he stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. The tax was a pittance. The real price is whatever the Baron says it is. And he wants you gone. His eyes slid past Cale and landed on Leanne, who stood frozen in the doorway of the house. His sneer widened. Well, what have we here? Wei's little curse. I heard the joke. Didn't think she'd last a week with the likes of you. He took a step toward her, his gaze lingering on her marked face with invasive glee. Maybe we'll take her as a down payment for the Baron. He appreciates curiosities. In that instant, Cale moved. It was not the clumsy charge of a brute, but the swift, economical violence of a trained warrior. He closed the distance in 2 silent strides. The first man saw it coming but was too slow. Cale's fist connected with his jaw with a sickening crack. The other 2, still mounted, scrambled for their weapons, but Cale was already on them. He grabbed the leg of the second rider and hauled him from the saddle, his body hitting the hard-packed earth with a grunt. The third spurred his horse, drawing a short sword, but Cale seized a discarded fence post, the wood groaning in his grip. He moved with a brutal grace Leanne had never imagined, a whirlwind of controlled fury. He was not just a rancher. He was something else entirely, something forged in a much harder fire. The fight was short and savage. Cale disarmed the third man and sent him and his horse fleeing into the hills. The other two lay groaning on the ground. He stood over them, his chest heaving, a dark look in his eyes she had never seen before. "Go back to your baron," he growled, his voice raw. "Tell him this land is not his. And tell him if he ever sends anyone near her again, I will send them back in pieces." He kicked their swords away and watched as they staggered to their feet, helped their leader onto a horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. Cale turned back to her. There was a deep gash on his forearm, bleeding sluggishly. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not pride in his victory, but a deep, somber pain, as if the violence had cost him a piece of the peace he had so carefully built. Leanne tore a strip from the hem of her finest remaining silk chemise, the soft fabric a stark contrast to the grim task at hand. She led Cale inside, pushing him gently into a chair. He submitted without a word, his body rigid with the aftermath of the fight. The silence in the small house was thick with unspoken things. She knelt before him, dipping the silk into a bowl of warm water she'd fetched from the hearth. As she began to clean the gash on his arm, he flinched, not from the pain of the wound, but from her touch. His skin was hot beneath her fingers. This was the first time she had ever truly touched him with such purpose, such intimacy. Her hands, usually so hesitant, were steady. The world narrowed to the wound, the steady drip of reddened water, the corded muscle of his forearm. She worked with a focus born of a desperate need to mend not just his skin, but the violence that had torn through their quiet life. "You were a soldier," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was not a question. The way he had moved, the lethal efficiency, it was not the work of a simple rancher. He watched her face, his gaze intense. After a long moment, he gave a single, slow nod. "A long time ago. In a war I did not choose, for a king I did not respect." His voice was rough with disuse, heavy with memory. "I left it behind. Or I tried to." She finished cleaning the wound, her touch gentle as she wrapped the gash with a clean strip of cloth. Her fingers brushed against his, and a current passed between them, a spark of warmth in the cold shadow of the day's events. She looked up, and her eyes met his. The guarded walls he kept around himself seemed to crumble for just a moment, and she saw a profound loneliness in their depths, a sorrow that mirrored her own. "Why did you defend me?" she asked, the question that had been screaming in her mind. "They insulted you." "I have been insulted my entire life," she replied, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "No one has ever fought for me." He reached out, his uninjured hand moving slowly, as if giving her time to pull away. He did not. His fingers, calloused and rough, gently traced the edge of the birthmark on her cheek. It was a touch devoid of pity or revulsion. It was a touch of simple, startling acceptance. "Their words are stones," he said, his voice low and fierce. "They were throwing them at you. I will not allow that." "Not here." He let his hand fall away, but the warmth of his touch lingered on her skin, a phantom caress that felt more real than any insult she had ever endured. In that moment, kneeling on the floor of their humble home, with the smell of blood and rain in the air, Leanne knew she was no longer just an outcast given as a cruel joke. She was home. And this man, this silent, scarred soldier, was her sanctuary. Baron Foam was not a man to accept defeat. The report from his battered collectors only stoked his avarice. Humiliated, he sent not thugs, but a specialist. A man known only as the Shadow, a bounty hunter renowned for his cruel intellect and his talent for breaking a person's spirit before breaking their body. The Shadow did not announce his arrival with riders and threats. His presence was a creeping poison. It began with small things. A dead raven left on their doorstep, its eyes pecked out. The well water turning brackish and foul overnight. Strange symbols carved into the trees at the edge of the property, symbols Cale recognized from the darker, more superstitious corners of the war he had fought. Fear, a cold and creeping thing, began to seep into the cracks of their sanctuary. Leanne found herself looking over her shoulder, the peaceful silence of the hills now filled with imagined whispers. Cale grew more vigilant, his periods of sleep shortening, his hand rarely straying from the hilt of a long knife he now kept tucked in his belt. The shadow's true game was psychological. One evening, Leanne found a small, exquisitely made doll lying on the path to the barn. It was dressed in noble silks, and across its porcelain face was a crudely painted red mark, mimicking her own. She dropped it as if it were a hot coal, her breath catching in her throat. It was a direct, personal violation, a message that the hunter knew her deepest wound. Cale found her staring at it, her face pale. He snatched the doll and threw it into the fire, where it blackened and curled into a monstrous shape. That night, the shadow's attack became more direct. He tried to set the barn ablaze, hoping to destroy Cale's horses, his livelihood. Cale, anticipating such a move, was waiting. The confrontation was not a brawl, but a deadly dance in the moonlight between two skilled combatants. Knives flashed, the sounds of their struggle were muffled grunts and the slide of leather. Leanne watched from the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, clutching the polished jade button in her hand like a prayer. Cale was stronger, but the shadow was faster, more cunning. He used Cale's protective instincts against him, feinting towards the house, forcing Cale to overextend. He managed to land a shallow cut on Cale's side before Cale's superior strength won out, disarming the hunter and pinning him to the ground. "The Baron will not stop," the shadow hissed, a triumphant smile on his bloody lips. "But it's not just him you should fear. I know who you are, Cale. The Butcher of the Black Ridge. Your own men feared you. Imagine what this little noble girl would think if she knew how many of her own people died on your blade." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Cale's face hardened, the brief victory turning to ash. He let the man go. The shadow laughed, melting back into the darkness. Cale turned to face Leanne, his expression stricken. The hunter had planted his poison after all. They had to leave. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary, it was a target. Cale knew the shadow would not be the last. Baron Foam would send more men, an army if he had to. Packing what little they could, some food, blankets, Cale's weapons, and the jade button Leanne now kept in a small pouch around her neck, they abandoned their home under the cover of darkness. They traveled into the jagged, inhospitable canyons that marked the edge of the barony, a place where Foam's men would be reluctant to follow. It was a hard, grueling journey. But they were not alone for long. On their second day, they came across a small, huddled group of people hiding in the shadow of a rock formation. It was an old farmer and his wife, their faces etched with despair. Baron Foam had seized their land, too, claiming an ancestral debt they couldn't pay. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs. Cale shared their food, and Leanne, seeing the old woman shivering, gave her one of their precious blankets. The next day, they found another family, a young couple with a small, feverish child, cast out for failing to meet the Baron's exorbitant grain levy. Leanne, using knowledge of herbs her mother's handmaiden had taught her long ago, found plants to soothe the child's fever. Wordlessly, a community of the dispossessed began to form around them. They were all broken, all victims of the same cruel avarice. They looked to Cale for protection, his quiet strength a shield against their fear. But they looked to Leanne for something more. She organized them. Using the administrative skills she'd been forced to learn in her father's palace, skills she had once resented, she rationed their meager supplies, organized watches, and directed the building of a hidden, defensible camp deep within a box canyon. She spoke to the hopeless, her voice steady and calm, her own story of being cast out giving them a strange kind of hope. The woman with the curse was not cursed. She was resilient. She was a leader. Her birthmark, once a source of shame, became an emblem of defiance. They saw it not as a flaw, but as a mark of her uniqueness, her strength. Cale watched this transformation with a quiet awe. The shy, shamed girl from the palace was gone. In her place was a woman of fierce compassion and unyielding will. He had tried to protect her from the world, but now she was building a new one in its heart. The found family grew, a small pocket of resistance in the wilderness. They were a testament to the fact that what society discarded could, when bound together by kindness and necessity, become something strong and beautiful. The existence of a thriving community of outcasts on his border was an intolerable insult to Baron Foam. It was more than a nuisance, it was a symbol of defiance that could inspire others. He decided to eradicate the problem permanently. He gathered his private army, a force of 50 well-armed and mounted men, and marched them toward the canyons. At the same time, rumors had finally trickled back to Lord Wei's court. Not of a simple runaway, but of a cursed witch leading a peasant rebellion on his western border, a witch who matched his daughter's description. It was an embarrassment, a stain on his authority. Driven by a mixture of fury and a morbid curiosity to see what had become of his cruel joke, he rode out with his own retinue of 20 elite guards. The two forces, unaware of each other, converged on the Box Canyon. Inside the camp, Kale and the outcasts prepared. They were not soldiers, but they had the land as their ally. They set rockfalls at the narrow entrance to the canyon, dug pits lined with sharpened stakes, and prepared bows and slings with the grim determination of people with nothing left to lose. Leanne moved among them, her presence a calming balm on their frayed nerves. She ensured the women and children were hidden in the deepest caves, and brought water to the men who stood guard. The Baron's army arrived first, their arrogance palpable. They stormed the canyon entrance only to be met by a devastating rockslide that crushed their vanguard and blocked their path. Chaos erupted. The outcasts rained down rocks and arrows from the canyon walls, their desperate courage making up for their lack of training. The battle was a brutal, swirling melee in the narrow confines. Kale was a whirlwind of death at the heart of the defense, his long knife and a captured sword a blur of motion. He fought with the ferocity of a man defending not just his life, but his soul. Just as the Baron's forces began to regroup, Lord Wei's retinue appeared on the ridge above the canyon. Seeing the battle below, he assumed it was all part of the peasant uprising. "Charge," he commanded his men. "Leave none of them standing." His guards plunged into the fray, turning the chaotic battle into a bloody three-way war. Baron Foam's men, caught between the defiant outcasts and the fresh, heavily armored guards, began to break. The canyon floor became a slaughterhouse, the air thick with the screams of the wounded and the clash of steel. In a brief, bloody lull, Lord Wei spurred his horse through the carnage, seeking the leader of the revolt. His eye scanned the canyon walls and landed on a figure standing on a high ledge, directing the defenders. A woman. He saw the dark hair, the determined set of her jaw, and then, as she turned her head, the unmistakable crimson mark on her face. A contemptuous sneer twisted his lips. "So," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, "the cursed daughter plays at being a queen of beggars and thieves. I should have had you drowned at birth." His words, meant to shatter her, were met with a steady, defiant gaze. Leanne did not flinch. She had heard his scorn her entire life, it had no power over her now. Below, the fighting intensified near the mouth of the canyon. One of the Baron's lieutenants rallied a small group for a final, desperate push toward the caves where the families were hiding. Kale saw the threat, his heart seizing with cold fear. He had to warn Leanne, to get her to safety. He fought his way toward the ledge, his voice raw with urgency and desperation as he shouted up to her. He used the name he called her only in the quietest moments, the name he had learned from her whispered sleep talk, a name she herself had almost forgotten. "And Leanne. To the left! They're breaking through." At the sound of that name, Leanne, Lord Wei froze. The sneer slid from his face, replaced by a look of utter shock, his knuckles white on his reins. Leanne. Peaceful Lotus. It was not his daughter's given name. It was her mother's. His first wife, the woman he had adored beyond reason, the woman who had died bringing their child into the world. He had banished the infant Leanne from his sight because the birthmark, in his grief-stricken mind, was the monstrous brand of the curse that had stolen his love. He had erased her mother's name from the palace, locked away her portraits, forbidden anyone to speak of her. He had never told his daughter her mother's name. He stared at the woman on the ledge, the daughter he had discarded, and for the first time, he did not see a curse. He saw his wife's eyes, his wife's defiant spirit, his wife's name given life again by a scarred foreign soldier in the heart of a bloody battle. The foundation of his hate, built over 2 decades of bitter grief, crumbled into dust. The battle raged around him, but he was lost, a ghost on a battlefield of his own making. Lord Wei's stunned inaction was a signal of defeat. His elite guards, seeing their leader frozen and unresponsive, lost their resolve. The Baron's men, already battered and caught in a pincer, broke completely, fleeing the canyon in a disorganized rout. The outcasts, bloody and exhausted, had won. They stood amidst the wreckage, their faces a mixture of disbelief, grief, and triumphant exhaustion. The canyon was quiet now, save for the moans of the injured. Cale climbed the ledge to Leanne's side. He checked her for injuries, his hands gentle, his eyes speaking volumes of his relief. Below them, Lord Wei slowly dismounted. He walked through the carnage like a man in a dream, his gaze fixed on his daughter. He stopped at the base of the ledge, his face a mask of anguish and regret. He looked like an old man, all the cruelty and arrogance stripped away, leaving only a hollowed-out shell. "And Leanne," he whispered, the name a painful confession. Leanne looked down at him, her expression not of triumph or hatred, but of a vast, weary peace. She had spent her entire life craving a single crumb of his approval, and now that it was laid bare before her, she found she no longer needed it. "That was my mother's name," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the quiet air. "You took it from me. You took everything. But you cannot have this. You cannot have this place, or these people." She gestured to the community that was already beginning to tend to their wounded, to rebuild. "We are what you threw away, Father. And we have built a home from the pieces." He opened his mouth to speak, to offer apologies, justifications, a plea for a forgiveness he did not deserve. She raised a hand to stop him. "Go," she said, her voice devoid of malice but full of finality. "Go back to your empty palace and your cold throne. Live with what you have done. That will be your penance." Lord Wei stared at her for a long moment, seeing the queen she had become. He saw his wife's strength in her, and the magnitude of his loss, the daughter he had never known, crashed down upon him. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and rode away, a broken man leaving the world he had tried to destroy. Leanne watched him go, then turned to Cale. She took his wounded hand in hers, her heart full not of vengeance, but of a future she would build herself. The epilogue of her old life had been written in blood and battle, the first chapter of her new one was about to begin. 2 years passed. The Box Canyon, once a desperate refuge, was now a thriving, secret settlement named and Leanne's refuge by its people. The desolate land, nurtured by hands that had nothing else to give, proved surprisingly fertile. Terraced gardens climbed the canyon walls, and a clever system of channels brought water from a hidden spring. The laughter of children, born into freedom, echoed where screams of battle once had. The community of outcasts had become a family, bound by their shared survival and their loyalty to the woman who had shown them their own worth and the soldier who protected them. Leanne was no longer defined by the mark on her face, but by the wisdom in her eyes and the compassion in her heart. She was their leader, their arbiter, their friend. Cale stood beside her, his past as a soldier finally laid to rest. The peace he had sought on his lonely ranch, he had found here, in the heart of this vibrant community, at her side. He was their guardian, their teacher, and the quiet strength that anchored them all. One evening, as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows through the canyon, Cale led Leanne to a small, flat-topped mesa that overlooked their entire settlement. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. He took her hand. In his palm was not the polished jade button he had once returned to her, but a simple ring, carved from the dark wood of the house they had been forced to abandon. He had ridden back for it, a pilgrimage to the place where their life together had begun. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was not a jewel from a lord's treasury, but it was infinitely more precious. It was a circle of wood from their first fire, their first shelter, their first peace. "You are my home, and Leanne," he said, his voice low and full of an emotion he no longer hid. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand holding his, the wooden ring warm against her skin. She looked out over the twinkling lights of their homes, at the families gathered around their fires, at the life they had built from the ashes of cruelty. "No," she whispered, her heart overflowing. "We are home together." They stood in the twilight, two outcasts who had found not only each other, but a world. It was a world born of a cruel joke, forged in violence, and redeemed by a love that was stronger than any army, deeper than any scar.